You know, the idea of aligning brand identity with segmentation seems a good approach, an effective approach. Why is it so hard for companies and brands to do?
Yeah, it's difficult, even though it sounds quite logical and straightforward. One of the main reasons it's difficult is because we often use the wrong segmentation variable. And by wrong, what I mean is these are variables like demographics, which first are no longer very predictive of preferences. That is, it is no longer as predictive what people would prefer based on their income and gender and where they even live. The second, as important, is it's not very meaningful in terms of guiding the company for its actions. So just because I know someone's gender and age, it gives us a very limited set of ideas of what to do in our execution compared to something like needs. If I know what they need and preferences, this is a much more meaningful segmentation variable. The more interesting question is, why do we keep on doing it? Why do we keep using demographics? And many companies, big ones as well, continue to use it. Three main reasons. One of them is history. It's been like this for many years. And historically, things used to be more simple, so that demographics used to predict preferences. Now it's more and more, not so. Second reason is it's easy. And as we know, unfortunately, we often go for the easy route. In this case, again, going for the more difficult route, need-based, would yield more effective, more meaningful results. And finally, it's a bit of an unfortunate reason, but we still judge people, like when we interview someone, based on their age, gender, ethnicity even. So there's a stereotyping judgment by categorization is something very human and basic, which unfortunately also happens in business.
I think there is also another reason that is more internal rather than external, which is that instead of thinking about the identity of the brand, we think about the current positioning of the brand. We don't really think about what made the brand successful to start with. And so we tend to actually follow the customers around rather than thinking about what does this brand really stands for and how can we make this brand still relevant for the customers that are changing. But if we follow the customers around and we forget where we come from, we're going to have a lot of problems. The one problem is that we are not believed. We are not credible. The second problem is that maybe there are other competitors doing whatever we want to do now to follow the customers around, and they're better for us. And the third thing is very expensive. You cannot just keep changing your positioning or your branding every time, given kind of the little flimsy customers that you want to go after. So instead of thinking of the identity, we actually think about the current positioning, and this is very different. The identity is more stable than the current positioning.
So that's an interesting point, Simona, because the next question was going to be around this whole aspect of brand identity needing to guide the evolution of the brand promise and why that's important.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so that's very important, and I think it's one of the best thing to do as a brand manager or as being in marketing, rejuvenating a brand, repositioning a brand. The best way to do it, in my mind, is to keep in mind this brand identity. So by brand identity, we mean what made that brand successful to start with. So what are the set of associations that made that brand successful when the brand started? Is the DNA of the brand, is the genetic program of the brand. So that is set in time, is set in history. But sometimes, you have to kind of introduce changes in your brand because what is relevant 100 years ago is not relevant any longer. What is differentiating 100 years ago may not be differentiating any longer. And the tendency is to go in and change everything. And by changing everything, you say, like, what is it that is relevant right now? Fashion, authenticity, CSR. But that's not the right way to go because, again, your brand may not be able to take you to these domains. You have to be faithful to that seed of the brand and introduce changes, but changes that are credible and consistent with the brand identity. Maybe sometimes you cannot carry one brand in that one domain that seems so promising, meaning that you have to create a different brand, or maybe you have to kill the brand. Other times, though, in a lot of cases that's the situation, you can rejuvenate the brand, you can refresh the brand, you can give a little spin to those initial associations, or you can just deliver them in a more modern way. So you don't really need to reinvent everything, but you have to just monitor how relevant your brand stays with the current consumers. And the moment in which you say that there is not the relevance any longer, you have to intervene with small changes rather than waiting until the brand is completely outdated and trying to do a big change that time may be dangerous.
Sure. And to touch on some of the aspects you brought up there, obviously identifying the insight and then converting it into a really good experience that matches that insight, that is credible and that the brand can carry. Again, is the advice that I think has been given to brand managers and brand marketers time and time again. You bring up an important aspect, which is to say managerial biases often obstruct that conversion. What, to your mind, are the key managerial biases that you've seen keep recurring from time to time across the entire universe of marketers that I've met?
Yeah. So this area of managerial biases is linked to this topic of behavioral science, behavioral economics, which is the underlying kind of foundation for our program. And I think what's important to do is to link these biases, which is often illustrated with individual behavior, to business processes. Okay, so what are the business processes that are inhibited or are constrained by these managerial biases? So one, for example, is being customer focused, which is the foundation of marketing and branding. And so that is the business process or business idea, and constraining it or inhibiting it is a bias called projection or false consensus, where we project our beliefs onto other people. If I believe that power in a car is the most important thing, I will have a tendency to also project it on other people and think that indeed maybe power is the most important aspect. So projection and false consensus is a managerial bias standing in the face of customer focus, which is the key thing we have all to do. Another one is what happens with market research, another business process which we all tend to do, and we think it's important to do, but doing effective marketing research is unfortunately often facing a bias called confirmation bias, where we tend to collect and remember information that confirms our hypotheses, confirms our beliefs, our assumptions. Okay, and the last one maybe is when we have to do, for example, prediction. What's the demand going to be? What's our forecast? How much people will talk, on Skype when Skype was introduced? We have to make a prediction about that. And when we make those predictions, we are often overconfident and have a very narrow interval for our predictions. And so I think the important thing is, the biases. I gave 3 examples, but also the importance of linking them to business processes and making sure we know what business process may be challenged by which bias.
Let's shift to the subject of customer experience, because that's obviously come into sharp focus over the last few years, and I suspect will continue to be a subject of focus. What are the key stages or dimensions of the customer experience that marketers need to keep in mind if they are to convert brand strategy effectively into brand strategy execution?
So these stages have been quite well established for a long time now. These are need recognition, so a person recognizes they might have a need for a product or a service. Then they might go through information search. They look through alternatives, look through internet, look through available options outside, online, offline. They might then consider a smaller set of alternatives, a consideration set they might have. Then they might choose among these alternatives, the key important moment of choice or decision, and then they would experience that choice. They would bring the product home and experience it, or go through the experience of the service. So I think this is not very new, these stages. What is more important and increasingly we know more about is that if we ask consumers about what's going to be stopping them or in the different stages, we often don't get very meaningful answers. Okay, so people do not know, for example, what will maximize their own experience when they consume a product or a service. So asking them may not be very useful. Instead, we need to increasingly rely on indirect methods to understand what maximizes someone's experience in the different stages. Okay, so for example, I might ask you, do you want an interruption in your massage when you have a massage? And you might say no. You would likely say no. But in fact, most likely you would benefit from an interruption. And there is evidence to suggest that. So rather than asking, we have to understand people's behavior through behavioral science and experiment and maybe observe.
The whole aspect of, as you're talking about, gaining consumer insight through less obvious methods than just asking and implementing directly what they've said, seems to have gained a lot of importance over the last few years. But could you tell us what's driving that? Are consumers becoming less honest, less less frank, less candid? What's driving this whole need to be unobvious in the method that we gain consumer insight?
So it's always been the way, right? I mean, it's not. In some cases, consumers do lie. Now, the most recent example, the elections, right? Both in the UK with the Brexit and in the US with Trump elections, the election of Trump as president, the polls were wrong. And this is one situation in which people tend to lie, especially if they are voting for a candidate that maybe is a bit dangerous or is a bit, for example, the extreme right candidates. A lot of nations in Europe now, unfortunately, there are a lot of them. Maybe usually these candidates are the ones that are more underrepresented in the polls, because if somebody's getting out of the poll and somebody's asking them, like, who did you vote? They're not happy to say, like, well, I just voted for the neo-Nazi in the poll, but they did. So in this case, they lie. And there are other aspects in which, like, money is another situations where people tend to lie and tend to say that they make more money than they do. So in some situations, consumers or people in general, they lie. In other situations, they don't know why they're doing something. They do not really have the personal insight for why, for example, interrupted massage is in fact more pleasurable than a non-interrupted massage. And so they have no idea why they do something, why they like something, why they prefer something, because it's out of habit or because it's just out of kind of unconscious type of behavior. And the third reason is that if you do ask why do you like something when you do not have a clue, you just tend to answer what is more rational. So if you ask consumers why do you buy something, they're going to give you very functional attributes. It's more comfortable, it's more convenient, it costs less, the quality is higher, even though that's not the real reason why they do something. But they're not going to tell you, I'm going to buy this pair of shoes because I feel powerless, and now with the heel on the shoes I feel powerful. Maybe I don't have an insight into this real reason, but also maybe I don't want to tell you because I look stupid. And so these are reasons that have always been there. But probably before there was not, it was kind of easier to do marketing. And even if you didn't have like very sophisticated techniques, you could go by, for example, demographic segmentation. There was a bit proxy between demographic and need-based segmentation. Today the world is more complicated, and you have to be more sophisticated in how you try to understand your consumer.
Yeah, just maybe to add to that, we also just know more. So, the behavioral sciences is not a very old field. It's been happening in the last maybe 10, 20 years that we know more about. And this knowledge doesn't disseminate so very fast either. So even in very big companies. So we know more, and the consumer research knows more. And it just takes a lot of time to implement this knowledge in practice.
So, you talk of, when you talk of behavioral sciences, essentially at one level trying to understand decision-making, choices. And the way brands respond to different choices, or at least try to cater to different choices, is by having a portfolio of options. And that's increasingly a way of, responding more sharply to specific segments and catering or converting unique insights. What would you say are the key facets of marketers to keep in mind that would make for a good portfolio strategy?
Yeah, so portfolio is another fascinating topic. We can stay here for a day just talking about portfolio, but I'll try to do it quickly. And you have to think about it as a spectrum of possibilities. At one end of the spectrum is a situation in which you have all different brands within a corporate brand, and all these brands are very independent from each other. So each brand has its own equity. Each brand has its own identity, its own target of consumers, its set of delivery tool, its experience, and everything kind of works within that brand. But there are no links among this brand and the other brand in the portfolio, or among this brand and the corporate brand. This is called the house of brands approach. At the other, end of the spectrum is a situation like maybe Tata is in the case too, in which you have the corporate brand that's kind of reflected in each one of these product brands. So you have the Tata Motors, and then you have the Tata Consulting, and you have the, so that Tata brand name is applied to different category, but the equity is in the Tata name. The identity is in the Tata name, and you just apply to different categories. You have in-between situation, the so-called endorsed brand. So, for example, something by Tata. And the sub-brand situation, which is two brands like Lenovo, ThinkPad. Two brands put one next to each other. So the sub-brand is closer to the so-called branded house, so the case in which there is only one corporate brand, and the endorsed brand is closer to the house of brands, the independent kind of brands. The most important thing to know about this is that at the two ends of the spectrum, there are pros and cons. The main pros and the main cons of being in a house of brand approach with all independent brands is that you have a lot of flexibility, right? You can be, if you're Mars, you can be in pet food and in people food, because you just call it different way, and people do not know, consumers do not know that they all come from the same corporate brand. So you can give even inconsistent promises, and nobody would care. The problem of this, the main cons, is that it's very expensive. It's very, very, very expensive to create all these different strong brands. There can be overlapping brands, there can be cannibalization in brands, but also it's very difficult to have the human and the financial resources to maintain each one of these brands. On the other side, the branded house approach, you have the different pros and cons. So the main pros is that you have a lot of synergy. Now you build only one brand equity and you use the same equity in different categories. But the main cons is that now you have to make sure that this equity really works in these different categories, and you are not inconsistent in the way you deliver in the different categories. So it requires a lot of consistency across different brands. What I always say is that your default, or the first question you should ask yourself, is whether you can have only one brand, or at least minimize the number of brands that you want in your portfolio. For financial reasons, mainly, because it's very expensive to have a lot of very strong brands. If that is not possible, then think about doing a sub-brand, and think about an endorsed brand, and only as a last resort to have like a complete separate brand. But don't do the other way around. Don't start from, can I have separate brands, and then move up, because the financial constraints are the most important constraints to take in mind.
Okay. Just a question about you all as people. Do you all like surprises?
Surprises? I do.
Simona likes surprises. Do you like surprises? More, you know,
not as much as Simona.
So you don't dislike surprises. So would it be okay if we surprised you all with a question that, or two questions, which are completely within your scope? Yeah,
Sure.
and feel free. You can. Once you'll realize they're so mundane and ordinary that they're not really surprising, except that I'm asking you without having sent these questions to you before. We're doing a little bit of thinking, and we love opinions of thought leaders such as yourself, and we're going to collect it. We're already collecting it have collected it from other CMOs within the group, not on camera though, more in interpersonal dialogue. And what we've asked them is, simply put, what in this day and age, what are the three big challenges they see in terms of marketing? And you all may have different opinions of what those three are. As well, separately from that, distinctly from that, what are the three big opportunities they see in marketing? Could you all oblige us?
Yeah, 3 or 1 is enough. Should I go first? The first one is the data. And it's the fact that now we have so much data that people, I guess, will just focus on the data only and lose sight of the strategy. While the strategy always has to be the starting point. So the fact that you have a lot of data, you can find anything in this data, but if you do not have the right question to ask this data, it's useless. So I think that we're losing sight of the strategy, and we are getting like all excited about the fact that we have this easy access to our consumers too. So that to me is the main. Maybe
just to add to that, other than losing the strategy, as we kind of mentioned before, there are also inherent issues in understanding and processing and collecting data. Like the one I mentioned before, confirmation bias, this is something that directly maps into this great opportunity. So the data is the opportunity, but the challenge is how do we use it in a meaningful way, in a strategic way? How do we use it in a way that this confirms assumptions rather than confirms them, which is what we want to do. We don't want to just test our assumptions, confirm them, because that's not very meaningful. So about data, I would just add to Simona that it's an opportunity, but there are these challenges, including managerial biases, including lack of strategy.
Yeah. But I think that there is a great moment for marketing people, because I think that we got swayed in the last year, for example, toward finance, towards operations, and now it's very difficult to. I mean, there are a lot of problems when it comes to finance, when it comes to operations, but it's very difficult to differentiate products. There is a lot of competition. All this data, everybody has access to all this data. So all this doesn't really differentiate any longer. What really differentiates you is a really good insight of the consumer, really consistent with the brand, and really a strong brand to start with. And that's why marketing is going to become very important, because marketing is the function that has this power. And the challenge is to make sure that this doesn't reside only in the marketing function, but becomes understood at the top management level, at the CEO level.
Yeah, let me just add again, the challenge with that is that, yes, it is an opportunity for marketers, for marketing people, or people with marketing orientation, let's say, wherever they are in the organization. The challenge is that some of the things that marketing people need to do, like investing in a brand, or like understanding, or like experimenting with A/B testing, for example. This is something that we're going to talk a lot about in the program. These things require effort, time, money, and often they have long-term kind of results. So we don't just get the feedback right away. Also, sometimes the feedback hurts. If you experiment, if you fail, it's costly. Some people will see a version of the product that is not ideal. So these are painful learning experiences, but we have to engage in them, and marketing should be the function that pushes these. So I think one of the opportunities is, like Simona said, this opportunity. The challenge is to have the organizational processes, organizational power, organizational understanding to facilitate these actions.
Okay, thank you so much. I've asked all the questions I wanted to. Kavita sent me a question to ask you about an iPhone. What is this? Sent from my... Is this a specific question? No, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.